Every wealthy rancher in Silver Creek believed Charlotte Hayes would choose the biggest ranch in the territory the moment she arrived. Then the stagecoach door opened. She stepped down into the dust, looked past every rich man standing in his best coat, and walked straight to the poorest cowboy in town. Nobody understood why, least of all Caleb Walker. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Chapter 1. The Poorest Man in Silver Creek. Silver Creek measured a man in cattle and acres. The bigger the herd, the more a man was greeted on the boardwalk. The wider the land, the louder the church bells seemed to ring for his family on a Sunday. And the poorer a man stood, the easier it became for the town to look straight through him, as if he were made of the same dust that coated his boots. Caleb Walker had lived on the wrong side of that measuring stick for 19 years. He was 36 now, and he had spent most of those years riding other men's horses, mending other men's fences, and branding cattle that would never carry his name. He slept in a bunkhouse he did not own, on a ranch he would never inherit, and each payday he counted coins that were gone again before the month was finished. He owned one horse, an aging gelding named Duke, with a grey muzzle and a stubborn streak. He owned one saddle, cracked and stitched twice at the seat. He owned his boots, resoled so many times the cobbler in town had started giving him a discount out of pity more than business sense. What Caleb Walker did not own was land or a herd, or the kind of name that made mothers in Silver Creek point him out to their daughters as a good match. Still, when Widow Foster's roof leaked through a spring storm, Caleb was the one on her ladder before sunrise, patching shingles for nothing but a slice of pie and a thank you. When a calf wandered off during a night thunderstorm, he was the one who rode out in the dark and brought it back cold and shivering but alive. When Old Man Tucker's fence blew down in a windstorm, Caleb had it standing again before Tucker even finished writing the letter asking for help. The town respected his work. They simply did not respect him. He had made peace with that a long time ago, or told himself he had. A man could only knock on a locked door so many times before he stopped expecting it to open. That morning Caleb stood outside the Mercantile with Sam Boone, an old cowhand who had taught him nearly everything he knew about cattle, horses, and the quiet kind of pride that did not need an audience. "You're wearing a hole clean through that hat brim," Sam said, nodding at the felt hat in Caleb's hands. "Man your age ought to own 2 hats at least." "A man my age ought to own a lot of things," Caleb said. "I've made peace with owning 1 hat." Sam chuckled, but there was something gentle underneath it. "You ever think about what you'd do different if things had gone another way for you?" "Wah." Caleb looked down the street toward the stage depot, where a small crowd was already gathering. Word had traveled fast that morning Silver Creek's first schoolteacher was arriving on the noon stage, sent all the way from Santi. "Louis, I think about it some," Caleb admitted. "Then I remember, what kind of woman goes looking for a schoolteacher's post in a cattle town? She won't be looking twice at a man who owns 1 horse and 1 hat." Sam only shook his head slowly, the way older men do when they already know something the younger man has not learned yet. Chapter 2. The Stagecoach. By noon, half of Silver Creek had found a reason to be standing near the depot. Wade Montgomery arrived first, as he arrived everywhere first, in a black coat with silver buttons and boots so polished they caught the sun like a mirror. He was the richest rancher in 3 counties, and everybody in Silver Creek knew it, mostly because Wade made certain of it. "A schoolteacher," Wade said to the men gathered around him, straightening his collar. "St. Louis bred, they say, educated, refined." He smiled the way a man smiles when he has already decided something belongs to him. Silver Creek could use a bit of refinement. Behind him stood 2 other ranchers, Harlan Dixon and Roy Fenwick, each of them dressed in their Sunday coats, though it was the middle of the week. Each of them, like Wade, had heard the same rumor. A young, unmarried schoolteacher was arriving with no family in the territory and no husband waiting for her. In a town where women were outnumbered nearly 4 to 1, that kind of news traveled faster than fire in dry grass. The stagecoach rolled in, trailing a cloud of dust, the driver calling out to the team as it slowed before the depot. Caleb stood near the back of the crowd, close enough to see, far enough that no one would think he had come for any particular reason. The door swung open. A gloved hand appeared first, followed by a woman in a deep blue traveling dress, a matching bonnet framing a face that was calm in a way most travelers were not after 3 days on a rough Montana road. She looked over the crowd once, unhurried, the way a person looks at a room they intend to remember. Wade stepped forward immediately, hat already in his hand. "Miss Hayes, I presume." "Wade Montgomery, welcome to Silver Creek." Charlotte Hayes offered a polite smile and a small nod, the kind of courtesy a woman learns to hand out evenly so that no man believes he has been given more than his neighbor. "In Mr. Montgomery," she said, "thank you for the welcome." Harlan and Roy introduced themselves in turn, each with their own version of the same performance land cattle, houses with real glass windows. Charlotte listened to each of them with the same even patience, answering their questions politely, offering nothing more. Then her gaze moved past them, toward the edge of the crowd, and settled on a man in a plain, sun-faded shirt, holding a hat with a worn brim, standing beside an older cowhand. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. But something about the way he stood quiet, unhurried, watching the scene without trying to be part of it, held her attention longer than any of the polished introductions had. Abigail Foster, the boarding house owner, stepped forward to greet her properly before the moment could stretch any longer. "Miss Hayes, I have your room ready at the boarding house. You must be exhausted from the road." "I am grateful," Charlotte said, finally looking away from the crowd. "More grateful than you know." As she walked toward the boarding house, she glanced back once, just once, toward the man with the worn hat. Caleb noticed. He looked down at his boots and said nothing. Chapter 3. The colt, Charlotte Hayes, settled into Abigail Foster's boarding house with 2 trunks of books and very little else. Within a week, she had scrubbed the old schoolhouse floor herself, arranged the benches, and hung a slate board she had brought all the way from St. Louis every evening. Ranchers found new reasons to visit the boarding house. Wade sent a bouquet of hothouse flowers that must have cost a fortune to ship in. Harlan brought a small mirror with a silver frame. Roy arrived with a box holding a ring he insisted was simply a token of friendship, though everyone in town understood exactly what kind of friendship he meant. Charlotte accepted each gift with polite thanks and returned none of the attention the men were hoping for. It was on a grey Tuesday morning, walking the path near Tucker's ranch on her way to visit a student's family, that she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. A colt had gotten its leg tangled in a broken section of wire fence, thrashing and screaming in a way that curdled the blood. 2 ranch hands stood nearby, arguing about whether to shoot the animal before it hurt itself worse. Before Charlotte could call out, a rider came tearing down the hill on a grey-muzzled gelding, swinging down before the horse had even fully stopped. It was the man from the depot, the one with the worn hat. Caleb moved toward the colt, slow and steady, talking low, his voice barely above a hum. The colt's ears flicked toward him, wild-eyed but listening. He knelt, careful of the flailing legs, and worked the wire free with hands that clearly knew this dance well. "Easy now," he murmured. "Easy, nobody's here to hurt you." "But..." The colt kicked once more, then went still under his hands, trembling but free. Caleb ran his palm down its trembling neck until the shaking slowed. The 2 ranch hands, who moments earlier had been ready to shoot the animal, only stood there watching. "You'll want to keep that leg wrapped a few days," Caleb said to them, standing and brushing the dirt off his knees. "Nothing broken. Just scared and cut up some." He did not ask for thanks. He did not look around for an audience. He simply gathered his hat from the ground, nodded once, and turned to walk back to his horse. Charlotte spoke before he could mount up. "That was well done," she said. Caleb turned, surprised to find he had an audience after all. "Ma'am, Charlotte Hayes," she said. "We were introduced briefly at the depot, though I don't believe I learned your name. Caleb Walker." He held his hat against his chest out of habit more than manners. I work over at the Dixon Spread, mostly. You knew exactly what to do, she said, glancing at the colt, now nuzzling at Caleb's shoulder. Most men would have let those hands shoot it. Animals not dangerous, Caleb said simply. Just scared. Scared things don't need shooting. They need somebody patient enough to slow down. Charlotte studied him a moment longer than politeness required. That's a rare kind of patience in a town like this. Caleb allowed himself a small, tired smile. Rare's one word for it, ma'am. Around here they mostly call it a waste of good time. He touched his hat brim and walked back toward Duke, leaving Charlotte standing at the fence line with a thought she had not expected to carry home with her. Chapter 4. The Choice at the Social. 3 weeks after her arrival, Silver Creek held its autumn social at the church hall, an event the town treated as though it might decide the entire winter's worth of gossip. Every wealthy rancher arrived early, dressed for the occasion, jockeying quietly for the first dance with the new schoolteacher. Wade Montgomery had already told half the men in town that he intended to claim that honor. Caleb had not planned to attend at all. He had spent the day mending a fence line on the Dixon Ranch and told Sam he would rather sleep than stand around in a church hall, watching men fight over a woman who was never going to look his direction twice. Sam had other ideas. "You clean up decent when you try," he said, tossing Caleb a shirt that had been ironed for the occasion. "Man ought to see what he's missing at least once before he decides it isn't for him." Caleb went, mostly to keep Sam company, and stood near the back wall with a cup of cider, watching the dancing from a comfortable distance. Wade approached Charlotte the moment the fiddle player started up a waltz, bowing with a flourish. "Miss Hayes, might I have this dance?" Charlotte accepted graciously, and for the length of one song, danced with the composure of a woman raised to handle exactly this kind of attention. When the song ended, Harlan and then Roy each took their turn, each pressing their case a little more directly than the last talk of houses, talk of land, talk of futures that sounded rehearsed rather than felt. Charlotte answered every question with warmth and gave away nothing. Near the punch table, Emily Carter, 10 years old, and full of the kind of honesty only children still carry freely, tugged on Charlotte's sleeve. "Miss Hayes, why don't you dance with Mr. Walker?" Charlotte glanced toward the back wall, where Caleb stood quietly with his cider. "I haven't been introduced properly, Emily. He's the nicest man in Silver Creek," Emily said factly. "He fixed my kitten's leg last spring, and he tells the best stories about wolves and stars. He just doesn't come to dances much because—" She stopped herself, suddenly aware she might be saying something she shouldn't. "Because?" Charlotte asked gently. Emily lowered her voice, the way children do when repeating something they overheard from adults. "Because Papa says nobody dances with a man who doesn't own land." Charlotte's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. She crossed the room directly, skirts brushing past Wade Montgomery mid-sentence, and stopped in front of Caleb Walker. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I understand. You tell excellent stories about wolves and stars." Caleb straightened, caught entirely off guard. "Emily's got a generous memory, ma'am. Would you care to dance?" The hall went quiet enough that the fiddle player almost missed his next note. Caleb looked at her, searching her face for the joke he was certain must be hiding somewhere in the invitation. He found none. "I'm not much for dancing," he admitted honestly. "Never had cause to learn it properly." "Then we'll manage badly together," Charlotte said, offering her hand. "I find that's often more honest than managing well alone." Caleb set down his cider, wiped his palm quickly against his trousers, and took her hand. They danced clumsily, missing steps, laughing quietly at their own mistakes, while every wealthy rancher in the room watched in stunned silence. Wade Montgomery's face went pale, then red, as his certainty walked out the door without him. The days after the social settled into something Silver Creek had not expected: a quiet, steady friendship between the schoolteacher and the poorest cowboy in town, built not on gifts or promises, but on small, ordinary moments, neither of them rushed. Charlotte began stopping by the Dixon spread on Saturday afternoons, ostensibly to check on the colt Caleb had rescued weeks earlier, though both of them understood the visits had little to do with the colt's health after the first week. One evening, with the sky turning the color of a ripe peach over the western rye, D.G. Caleb built a small fire near the corral fence, while Emily Carter, who had insisted on tagging along, sat cross-legged in the dirt feeding grass to the colt through the rails. "Teach me to ride like you do," Emily demanded, the way only a 10-year-old can demand something and expect it granted. "Riding like I do just means falling off more times than most," Caleb said, but he lifted her onto Duke's broad back anyway, walking beside the gelding with one steady hand on the bridle, while Emily gripped the mane and grinned wide enough to show the gap in her front teeth. Charlotte watched from the fence rail, arms folded against the evening chill, and found herself smiling in a way she had nearly forgotten how to do since her husband's passing back in Boston, long before St. Louis, long before any of this. "You're good with her," Charlotte said, once Emily had been walked in a slow, careful circle 3 times and declared herself an expert horsewoman. "Children and animals," Caleb said, settling beside her on the fence rail, once Emily had run off to pick wildflowers along the creek. "Neither one cares what a man owns. They only care whether he's kind and whether he keeps his word." "A rare philosophy in a town like this," Charlotte said. "Rare's one word for it," Caleb said again, echoing himself from weeks earlier, and this time they both laughed at the memory. They sat a while without talking, watching the fire settle into embers, the kind of silence that only grows comfortable between two people who have stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with words. "I buried a husband 3 years ago," Charlotte said eventually, her voice low. "Consumption. Peaceful, in the end, but slow getting there. I came west because I did not want to spend the rest of my life being pitied in a city that already knew every detail of my grief. I wanted a place where I could simply be Charlotte Hayes, school teacher, and nothing more." "And now?" Caleb asked. "Now I find I want to be something more after all," she said, looking at him directly. "I simply had to travel 2,000 miles and meet the poorest man in Silver Creek before I remembered what wanting felt like." Caleb did not know what to say to that. So instead he reached over, careful and unhurried, and took her hand resting on the fence rail. She did not pull away. The fire popped once, sending a small shower of sparks up into the darkening sky, and neither of them moved until Emily came running back with a fistful of wildflowers, announcing loudly that supper was surely growing cold at the boarding house. Chapter 5. Wounded Pride. Wade did not sleep well that night. He sat in his study long after the social had ended, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow, replaying the moment Charlotte Hayes had crossed the room for a man who mucked out other people's stables. Pride, for a man like Wade, was not a feeling. It was a foundation, and foundations do not tolerate cracks quietly. By morning, he had convinced himself the matter was simple. Charlotte Hayes did not yet understand how Silver Creek worked. She was new, unfamiliar with the town's proper order. Once she understood who truly mattered here, she would come to her senses. He rode out to the schoolhouse that afternoon with a bouquet twice the size of his first, and a new offer, a house in town, fully furnished, hers the day she agreed to marry him. Charlotte declined as gently as she could manage. "I'm flattered, Mr. Montgomery, but I did not travel 2,000 miles to marry a house." Wade's smile thinned. "Then perhaps you traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who owns nothing at all." "I traveled here to teach," Charlotte said evenly. "Whatever comes after, that is my own choice to make, and mine alone." Wade left without another word, but the look on his face carried down Main Street long before he did. By the following week, whispers had begun moving through Silver Creek like smoke through a closed room. Somebody had seen Caleb Walker near the Montgomery herd late one evening. Somebody else swore they'd heard him arguing with a cattle buyer about payment owed. A rancher 2 farms over-reported 3 head of prime breeding cattle missing from his herd, and within a day Caleb's name had attached itself to the rumor the way a burr attaches to wool. Caleb heard the whispers before anyone said a word to his face. He felt them in the way conversations stopped when he entered the mercantile, in the way men who had shaken his hand a month earlier now nodded stiffly and looked away. Sam found him mending fence alone one evening, jaw tight, hands moving faster than the work required. "Somebody's building a case against you," Sam said plainly. "And it isn't building itself. I haven't touched a single head of cattle that wasn't mine to move," Caleb said. "Doesn't seem to matter what's true when a man like Wade Montgomery wants a different story told. Then we find out who's telling it," Sam said, "before it finishes telling itself." Good as Sam had spent 11 years working the Montgomery spread before he retired to a small cabin on the edge of town, and he still remembered the particular way Wade handled men who crossed him. A fired hand once found his references quietly ruined across 3 counties. A rival buyer once found his cattle contracts mysteriously cancelled the week before a sale. Wade never raised his voice and never raised a fist. He simply made certain the ground shifted under a man's feet until he had nowhere left to stand. He did this to a fellow named Garrison. "Years back," Sam said. Fellow made the mistake of courting a girl Wade fancied. Garrison woke up one morning accused of rustling, same as you, and he left the territory inside a month rather than fight it. I always wondered if the accusation was true. I don't wonder anymore. "Why didn't you say something back then?" Caleb asked. "Because I needed the wage and I was a coward about it," Sam admitted, no shame hiding in the honesty. "I've had a long while to think on that since. I don't intend to make the same mistake twice while I've got breath left in me." Chapter 6. The Accusation. The accusation came formally on a cold morning in late October. Sheriff Owen Brooks rode out to the Dixon Ranch with 2 deputies and a look on his face that suggested he wished he were anywhere else. Harlan Dixon, missing 3 prime breeding cattle from his herd, had filed a complaint naming Caleb Walker as the last man seen near that section of fence line the night the cattle disappeared. Forged papers had surfaced as well, a bill of sale bearing Caleb's signature, selling the missing cattle to a buyer 2 counties over. Caleb had never signed any such paper in his life, but the signature matched his well enough to convince a nervous town looking for someone to blame. "I have to ask you to come into town, Caleb," Sheriff Brooks said, not unkindly. "Answer some questions properly." Caleb did not resist. He climbed onto Duke without argument, jaw set, and rode into Silver Creek with the same quiet composure he carried into everything else. Word reached the schoolhouse before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Charlotte closed her class early, unable to hold her attention on lessons, while her mind kept circling back to the same certainty. "He didn't do this," she said to Abigail that evening, pacing the small parlor of the boarding house. "I know it in my bones." "Knowing something and proving it are 2 different animals," Abigail said gently, though there was steel underneath her gentleness. "I've watched this town chew up better men than Wade Montgomery for daring to want something above their station. I nearly lost my boarding house to him once, when I refused to sell it at his price. He does not forgive a woman who says no to him, and he will not forgive a man who takes something he believes belongs to him." "Then we prove it," Charlotte said, "whatever it takes." Sam Boone had already begun asking quiet questions of his own, the kind an old coward can ask without anyone suspecting he is asking anything at all. He remembered things from his years working the Montgomery spread, a foreman named Ezra Colt, who had a talent for changing a brand so smoothly the county inspector never blinked twice. Wade's had that trick up his sleeve before, Sam told Caleb through the bars of the small jailhouse cell. "I saw it once, years back, and kept my mouth shut because I needed the work. I won't keep it shut a second time." Wali Kautibe. Charlotte visited the jailhouse the evening before the storm broke, carrying a basket of bread Abigail had insisted she bring, though both women understood the bread was only an excuse. Caleb sat on the narrow cot, elbows on his knees, and did not rise when she entered. "This isn't the sort of place I wanted you seeing me." "Or see? I've seen worse places hold better men," Charlotte said, setting the basket down through the bars. "And I've seen finer houses hold far worse. Folks in this town believed the worst of me quick enough," Caleb said quietly. "Makes a man wonder how much of their good opinion he ever really had. Then let them wonder what they'll say when the truth finally catches up to them," Charlotte said. "I did not choose you because a whole town approved of it. I chose you because of what I saw with my own eyes, and nothing that's happened since has changed what I saw." Caleb looked up at her, something loosening in his shoulders for the first time since Sheriff Brooks had come for him. Most folks would have run the other direction by now. "I'm not most folks," Charlotte said simply, "and you are not most men, whatever this town decides to call you this week." He reached through the bars and she took his hand, and for a long moment neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed saying. Chapter 7. The Storm. The trial was set for the following week, but Silver Creek's weather had other plans. A storm rolled down from the mountains on a Thursday evening, the kind that turned the sky the color of a bruise, and sent every animal in 3 counties running for cover. Lightning split the ridge above the Montgomery herd, and within minutes several hundred head of frightened cattle broke through a weakened section of fence and began stampeding straight toward the edge of town. The schoolhouse sat almost directly in their path. Charlotte had kept several children late that evening, helping them with reading before the storm rolled in, Emily Carter among them. When the ground began to tremble under a sound like distant thunder that never stopped rolling, Charlotte understood exactly what was coming. "Emily, gather the others," she said, voice steady, despite the fear rising in her throat. "We need to move now." Word of the stampede spread through town in a wave of shouting and slamming doors. Wade Montgomery, watching from his own porch as his herd turned wild, made a single decision that would follow him the rest of his life. He rode toward his private stock barn to save his prize bulls, leaving the herd, the schoolhouse, and the town behind him. Caleb Walker was still locked in the small jailhouse cell when the first tremor reached town, but Sheriff Brooks, hearing the commotion outside, made a decision of his own. "I need every hand I can get," Brooks said, already reaching for his keys. "I can't in good conscience leave you locked up while children are in that herd's path. You run, I'll answer for it. You help, we'll settle the rest after." Caleb was on Duke's back before the cell door had fully swung open. He rode straight toward the schoolhouse, cutting across the fields faster than the storm itself seemed to allow, arriving just as the first riders of the stampede crested the low hill above the building. "Get them behind the stone wall," Caleb shouted to Charlotte, already swinging down from his horse. "Now." Charlotte herded the children toward the low stone fence bordering the schoolyard, while Caleb rode hard along the flank of the herd, waving his hat and shouting, turning the leading cattle just enough to split the stampede around the building rather than through it. Emily, youngest and slowest among the children, stumbled near the edge of the yard, directly in the path of the herd's remaining edge. Caleb saw her fall before anyone else did. He turned Duke sharply, riding straight into the thinning edge of the stampede, leaning low from the saddle to scoop Emily up in one arm as cattle thundered past, on either side close enough to feel their heat. He set her safely behind the stone wall, then turned back one final time toward the herd, riding the flank until the last of the frightened cattle scattered into the open field beyond town rather than through it. By the time the rain began to slow, Silver Creek stood mostly intact, its schoolhouse untouched, its children shaken but safe. Caleb slid down from Duke's back, breathing hard, rain running down a face streaked with mud, and found Charlotte already crossing the yard toward him. She did not say a single word. She simply took his face in both hands and held it there, steady, the way a person holds something they have almost lost. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. In the chaos of the storm's aftermath, Emily Carter remembered something she had seen 2 nights earlier, something that had frightened her too much to mention until now. "I saw a man near the Montgomery barn," she told Sheriff Brooks the next morning, Charlotte's hand steady on her shoulder. He was holding a hot iron, and he was pressing it against a different mark on one of the cattle. "I didn't understand what I was looking at until now." Sam Boone stepped forward with what he knew. That'll be Ezra Colt, Wade's foreman. I've seen him do that trick before, changing a brand so clean the inspector never catches it. Man Wade paid to make an honest rancher's cattle disappear into his own herd. Sheriff Brooks, who had spent the stampede riding beside a man he was legally bound to consider a suspect, had seen enough that night to reconsider everything the town had assumed about Caleb Walker. He rode out to the Montgomery ranch that same afternoon with a warrant in hand and Sam Boone beside him as a witness. Ezra Colt, faced with the accusation directly, folded within the hour, admitting that Wade Montgomery had ordered the brands changed and the forged bill of sale created to place the blame squarely on Caleb. Man never did like being told no, Ezra admitted quietly. Reckoned if he couldn't have the woman, he'd at least see to it the cowboy lost everything else. Wade Montgomery was arrested before sundown, his silver-buttoned coat looking considerably less impressive against the bars of the same jailhouse cell that had held Caleb only days before. News of the truth moved through Silver Creek faster than any rumor had. By evening, the whole town had gathered near the church, drawn less by any announcement and more by the simple need to see for themselves that the story had turned. Charlotte walked through the crowd toward Caleb, who stood near the church steps, still dressed in his mud-streaked work clothes, looking every bit as unpolished as he had the day she arrived. She took his hand in front of the entire town, the same gesture that had scandalized Silver Creek weeks earlier, except this time nobody watching seemed scandalized at all. The poorest man in Silver Creek, Charlotte said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, turned out to be the richest where it mattered. Or, Chapter 9, What Silver Creek Learned. In the weeks that followed, the same ranchers who had once looked past Caleb Walker on the boardwalk found new reasons to shake his hand. Harlan Dixon offered him a partnership on a small section of grazing land, an apology dressed up as an opportunity. Roy Fenwick admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he had misjudged a man's worth by the size of his herd for most of his life, and intended to do better going forward. Reverend Thomas Reed used the story from his pulpit that Sunday, not to shame anyone by name, but to remind the congregation of something Silver Creek had nearly forgotten. "We have a habit," Reverend Reed said, "of counting a man's cattle before we count his character. Caleb Walker owned one horse and one hat, and he rode into a stampede to save children who were not his own. Wade Montgomery owned more land than any 3 men could ride across in a day, and when the herd broke loose, he rode to save his bulls. Let that settle with you a while before you decide again what wealth truly means." Abigail Foster, sitting in the third pew, reached over and squeezed Charlotte's hand. Emily Carter, sitting beside her father, whispered loud enough for half the pew to hear, "I told you he was the nicest man in Silver Creek." Chapter 10, The Wedding. By spring, Caleb Walker owned something he had never expected to call his own, a modest parcel of land near the creek. Purchased with savings he had quietly kept for years, and a fair wage finally earned honestly from Harlan Dixon's new partnership. It was not the biggest ranch in the territory. It never would be. But it was his, built plank by plank with his own hands, and Sam Boone's, and the help of neighbors who had once looked past him, and now looked for reasons to lend a hand. The wedding took place beneath the cottonwood trees along the creek, the same trees Caleb had ridden past 1,000 times without ever imagining they would one day shade his own vows. Reverend Reed presided, Sam Boone stood beside Caleb as the closest thing he had to family, and Emily Carter, dressed in her Sunday best, scattered wildflowers along the aisle with the seriousness of a girl who understood she was witnessing something important. Charlotte wore blue, the same color she had worn the day she stepped off the stagecoach and walked past every wealthy rancher in Silver Creek toward the poorest cowboy in town. "I have been asked more than once these past months," Reverend Reed said to the gathered crowd, "why a woman as fine as Charlotte Hayes would choose a man who owned so little when she arrived. I believe the answer stands in front of you today. She was never counting his cattle. She was counting his character, and she found more of it in him than in every wealthy rancher in this territory combined." Caleb took Charlotte's hands in his, rough and calloused against her gloved fingers, and spoke the only vow he had ever truly practiced his whole life without knowing it. "I don't have much to give you," he said quietly, just for her. "Never did, but everything I have, I'll spend the rest of my life giving it honestly." "That," Charlotte said, smiling through the beginning of tears, "is more than every rich man in this territory offered me combined." They were married beneath the cottonwoods as the creek ran quietly beside them, the same creek that had watched Caleb Walker ride past for 19 years as a man with nothing, and now watched him stand as a man with everything that mattered. Silver Creek changed slowly after that spring, the way most towns change, not all at once, but one small choice at a time. A rancher offered fair wages to a hired hand instead of the lowest he could manage. A family invited a poor neighbor to supper instead of passing his cabin without a glance. Children grew up hearing the story of the schoolteacher and the cowboy, and somewhere in the retelling, they absorbed a lesson their parents had needed a stampede to learn. Caleb Walker never did become the richest man in Silver Creek. He never wanted to be. He became something the town found harder to measure and easier to respect, a man whose word was worth more than his land, whose kindness had never once depended on what it might earn him in return. Charlotte kept teaching at the schoolhouse for years afterward, and every autumn, when a new family arrived on the stagecoach, she made a point of telling them the same thing she had learned the day she first stepped down into Silver Creek's dust. A man's worth was never carried in his pockets. It was carried in his hands, in his choices, and in the quiet moments nobody else was watching. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.